The woman who entered the courtroom that morning was not remarkable in any way that would cause a person to look twice. She was simply there, a face in the crowd, taking a seat on the hard wooden benches near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The courtroom of the Old Bailey, in London, carried the weight of centuries within its walls. The air thick with the smell of polished oak and the particular tension that precedes a judgment. She was dressed modestly, a dark coat buttoned to the neck, her hair pulled back from a face that might have been pretty under different circumstances, but now seemed carved from something pale and unmoving. She could have been a clerk, a shop girl, a young wife attending out of morbid curiosity. No one noticed the way her eyes moved constantly, not following the barristers in their wigs and gowns, but fixed on one man and one man alone, the guard who stood ramrod straight beside the judge's bench, his uniform pressed and proper, his face a careful blank. The guard's name was Corporal James Hatherley, and he was a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to show nothing. His back was a straight line against the dark wood paneling, his white-gloved hands resting on the polished stock of the ceremonial rifle that stood with its butt on the floor beside him. He was 34 years old, a veteran of colonial campaigns that had left him with a limp that only showed when he thought no one was watching, and a chest full of medals he never wore. He had been a palace guard, a soldier who had stood watch at Buckingham Palace itself. His face as immobile as the stone lions in Trafalgar Square, while tourists snapped photographs and children waved. He had learned to ignore catcalls, weather, fatigue, and the particular ache of homesickness that came with standing in the rain while others hurried past to warm fires and waiting families. But he had never learned to ignore her. Her name was Eliza Thorne, and she was his sister. The court was hearing the case of Regina versus Marcus Thorne, and the defendant in the dock was their brother. He stood behind the thick glass of the secure dock, a young man of 26 who had once been a printer's apprentice with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that could fill a room. Now he wore the gray uniform of a remand prisoner. His face, thinner than it had been 6 months ago when they had taken him away, but his eyes hollow with the particular despair of a man who has watched the noose being slowly tightened around his own neck. The charge was murder, and the evidence, laid out by the Crown's barrister in tones of ringing certainty, seemed damning. A pawnbroker named Samuel Pike had been found bludgeoned in his shop on the night of November 15th, his strongbox broken open and his money gone. Marcus Thorne had been found near the scene, disoriented and with blood on his coat, unable to give a proper account of himself. He had been a fool, Eliza knew, a fool who drank too much and fell in with bad company, but he was not a killer. She knew this with the same certainty that she knew her own name, and the same certainty that had driven her to pawn her mother's brooch to pay for a solicitor who had done nothing but collect his fee and then stand aside while the prosecution built its case. The trial had been a mockery from the beginning. The prosecution's witnesses had testified with the smooth confidence of people who had rehearsed their lines. The pawnbroker's assistant, a nervous young man with a twitch, had identified Marcus as the man he had seen lurking outside the shop. A constable had described finding Marcus half-conscious in an alley, the blood on his coat still wet. The medical examiner had testified that the murder weapon, a heavy iron bar, could have produced the wounds he had examined on the victim's head. And through it all, Marcus's court-appointed solicitor had sat with his head down, making notes that seemed to lead nowhere, objecting to nothing, letting the rope be woven strand by strand. Eliza had watched from the gallery, her hands gripping the rail until her knuckles were white, wanting to scream, wanting to stand up and tell them all that they were wrong, that her brother could never do such a thing, that the blood on his coat was his own from a cut he had received when he fell, that he had been nowhere near the pawnbroker's shop that night. But she had remained silent because silence was all she had left. and because she knew that words would not save him. The judge was Sir Alistair Finch, a man whose reputation for severity was legendary throughout the legal world. He was old, older than he looked from a distance, with a face that seemed to have been carved from the same oak as the bench he sat upon. And his eyes were small and sharp behind his spectacles, missing nothing, weighing everything. He had presided over more capital cases than any living judge, and it was said that he had never once recommended mercy. He believed in the law as other men believed in God, with a certainty that admitted no doubt and no exception. He believed that the purpose of a trial was to determine guilt, and that once guilt was determined, the purpose of a sentence was to serve as an example. He had sent dozens of men to the gallows, and he slept soundly every night, convinced that he was doing the Lord's work. As he looked down at Marcus Thorne from his elevated bench, there was no hatred in his eyes, no cruelty. There was simply nothing at all which was worse. Marcus Thorne was not a man to him. He was a case number, a name on a docket, a problem to be resolved. The morning of the final day, the courtroom was packed. The public galleries were full to overflowing, people standing in the aisles, craning their necks for a better view. The newspapers had covered the trial extensively, playing up the brutality of the murder and the apparent guilt of the accused. There was a hunger in the crowd, a thirst for resolution, for the satisfying finality of a conviction. Eliza had arrived early, pushing through the crowd outside, enduring the jostling and the rude comments, claiming her seat on the hard bench, and then waiting, hour after hour, while the machinery of justice ground slowly toward its conclusion. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She had simply sat, her eyes fixed on her brother's back, willing him to be strong, willing him not to break. And Corporal Hatherley had seen her the moment she entered. He had not turned his head, had not moved a muscle, but he had seen her. His peripheral vision was a soldier's gift, trained into him through years of service, and it missed nothing. He had watched her take her seat, had noted the pallor of her face, the way her hands gripped the edge of the bench. He had watched her throughout the trial, day after day, and each day she had seemed smaller, paler, more desperate. He loved her more than anything in the world. He had raised her after their parents died, had worked extra shifts to keep her in school, had walked her down the aisle when she married a good man, who had then died of fever, leaving her alone. He had protected her all her life, and now she sat in this courtroom watching her other brother, the baby of the family. The one they had both spoiled and cherished, being led step by step toward the gallows. And he could do nothing. He was a soldier. He was a guard. He had taken an oath. He stood still and watched, and inside him something was breaking. The morning session proceeded with the relentless pace of a machine. The prosecution delivered its closing argument, a masterful summation that painted Marcus Thorne as a desperate man driven to violence by greed. The defense solicitor rose and delivered a few mumbled sentences that amounted to little more than a plea for mercy. It was hopeless, and everyone in the room knew it. Eliza watched the jurors, 12 men and women who had sat through days of testimony, their faces carefully blank. She tried to read them, to find some sign of doubt, some flicker of humanity, but they were as unreadable as the judge himself. When they filed out to begin their deliberations, the room seemed to exhale, a collective release of tension that was immediately replaced by a new kind of waiting, worse than the first. The wait lasted exactly 47 minutes. Eliza counted every one of them on the large clock that hung above the judge's bench, watching the minute hand jerk forward in increments that felt like hours. Around her, the crowd murmured and shifted. People leaving to use the facilities, returning with cups of tea, whispering to one another about the likely outcome. She heard fragments of conversation. Casual speculations about whether the lad would hang, whether he'd get transportation instead, whether the judge would make an example of him. They spoke as if it were a game. Yeah, as if the life of her brother were a matter of entertainment, something to discuss over dinner. She hated them all with a hatred so pure and so complete that it frightened her, because she had never hated anyone before, had never known that such hatred was possible within a human heart. When the jury filed back in, their faces told the story before the foreman even spoke. They would not look at Marcus. They would not look at anyone. They kept their eyes fixed on the floor, on the walls, on anything except the man whose life they held in their hands. The clerk asked the formal question, and the foreman, a heavy-set man with a florid face and a nervous twitch, cleared his throat and said, "Guilty." The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward, touching everyone in the room. Someone in the gallery gasped. A woman began to cry. Marcus Thorne stood in the dock, his face as white as paper, and he did not make a sound. Eliza Thorne rose from her seat. It was an involuntary movement, her body responding to something before her mind could catch up. She stood, and she looked at her brother. And for a moment their eyes met across the crowded room. She saw in his face not fear, not despair, but something worse. Acceptance. He had given up. He had believed them. He had come to believe that he was guilty, that he deserved this, that his life was worth nothing. And in that moment, something in Eliza Thorne hardened into a resolve that would have astonished anyone who knew her, who thought of her as a quiet young widow, a woman of no particular consequence. She did not scream. She did not faint. She simply sat back down and waited for what came next, and her eyes moved from her brother to the judge, and from the judge to the guard who stood beside him, and she began to wait for the moment that she knew, with absolute certainty, was coming. Judge Sir Alistair Finch adjusted his spectacles and began to speak. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who has performed this ritual so many times that it has become routine. He spoke of the heinous nature of the crime, of the sanctity of human life, of the duty of the court to protect the public from those who would do violence. He spoke of the evidence, which he characterized as overwhelming and conclusive. He spoke of the jury's verdict, which he described as just and proper. And then he paused, and the room held its breath. And he reached for the square of black cloth that lay on the bench before him, the traditional cap that judges donned when pronouncing a sentence of death. Eliza Thorne's right hand moved to her left sleeve, and with a motion so small that no one noticed, she adjusted the cuff. It was a gesture that meant nothing to anyone who might have seen it. A woman fidgeting with her clothing, a trivial movement in a moment of high tension. But Corporal James Hatherley saw it, and he understood. It was the signal they had used since childhood, a code they had devised when they were small and their father had come home drunk and dangerous, a way of saying without words, "I need you. Now." It meant danger. It meant that everything depended on the next few seconds. It meant that she was asking him to do something, and that he had never in his life refused her anything. The judge placed the black cap upon his wig. He opened his mouth to speak the words that would send Marcus Thorne to the gallows. And Corporal James Hatherley moved. He did not think. There was no time for thinking, no space for the careful weighing of consequences that had governed his entire adult life. He simply moved, his body responding to a command that came from somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere older than duty or oath or the uniform he wore. He stepped forward, away from his post beside the bench, and in the same motion he raised his rifle from its resting position. The courtroom erupted in confusion, people screaming, rising from their seats, constables lunging forward too late. Judge Finch looked up, his mouth still open, his eyes widening behind his spectacles as he saw the soldier coming toward him, and then the butt of the rifle came down, once, with terrible force, and the judge slumped forward onto his bench, blood streaming from a wound on his temple, the black cap falling from his head and landing on the floor like a dead bird. The room dissolved into chaos. Women shrieked, men shouted, constables struggled to push through the surging crowd. Marcus Thorne stood frozen in the dock, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. And in the midst of it all, Eliza Thorne remained seated, her hands still folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her brother with an expression of calm that was more terrible than any scream. She had done what she had come to do. She had saved him, not from the gallows, perhaps, but from the moment of his death, and from the final cruelty of hearing those words spoken over him. She had bought him time, a few minutes, a few hours, a lifetime of memory. And as the constables finally reached her brother's guard and wrestled him to the floor, as James Hatherley went down without resistance, his face peaceful, his eyes finding hers across the tumult, she nodded once, a small movement that only he could see. It was finished. It was begun. And nothing would ever be the same. The holding cell beneath the courthouse was cold and damp, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and stayed there, a permanent resident. James Hatherley sat on the narrow bench that was the cell's only furnishing, his back against the stone wall, his hands resting on his knees. They had taken his uniform, replaced it with the rough gray canvas of a remand prisoner, and they had left him alone with his thoughts for the first time since the explosion of violence that had shattered the courtroom's solemnity. He could still hear the echoes of it in his mind, the screams, the crash of the rifle butt against the judge's skull, the heavy thud of bodies as the constables had tackled him, the strange silence that had followed when it was all over. He had not resisted. He had done what he had come to do, and when it was done, he had simply stopped, allowing himself to be taken, allowing himself to be beaten and dragged and thrown into this cell like a sack of grain. He felt no fear, no regret, no anxiety about what was to come. He felt only a profound and bone-deep peace, the peace of a man who has finally, after years of waiting, done the thing he was always meant to do. The door opened. So when a man in a dark suit entered, carrying a lantern that cast long shadows across the stone floor. He was thin, middle-aged, with a face that might have been handsome once, but had been worn down by years of disappointment and cheap tobacco. He set the lantern on the floor and sat down on the bench opposite Hatherley, studying him with an expression that was more curiosity than anything else. "My name is Graham," he said. "I'm a solicitor. I've been assigned to represent you." Hatherley looked at him without speaking. He had nothing to say to solicitors, to lawyers, to any of the men who made their living from the suffering of others. He had watched them for days in that courtroom, had seen the way they manipulated words and twisted meanings. Had seen them send his brother toward the gallows with their smooth voices and their careful arguments. He wanted none of them. Graham seemed unbothered by the silence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled packet of cigarettes, offered one to Hatherley, and when the soldier refused, lit one for himself. The smoke curled upward in the still air, blue and fragrant, a small comfort in the cold. "You'll hang, of course," Graham said matter-of-factly. "Striking a judge in his own courtroom in the middle of passing sentence? There's no question. They'll make an example of you. The only question is whether there's anything you want to say first, anything that might, I don't know, matter to someone. Family, friends." Hatherley closed his eyes. He thought of Eliza, sitting in that courtroom, watching him being taken away. Now he thought of her face, that small nod she had given him, the understanding that had passed between them in the chaos. He thought of Marcus, still in his cell somewhere, probably not understanding what had happened or why, probably thinking it was all some kind of mistake or madness. He thought of his parents, long dead, who had raised their children to be good, to be honest, to stand by one another no matter what. He had done that. He had stood by his sister. He had stood by his brother. Whatever happened now, no one could take that from him. "There's nothing," he said. His voice was hoarse, unused, and the words came out rough and low. "Nothing to say." Graham nodded as if he had expected this answer. He smoked his cigarette in silence for a while, watching Hatherley with those curious eyes. "The judge will live," he said eventually. "A concussion, broken skull, but he'll live. They say he's already asking questions, demanding to know who the soldier was, why he did it. He seems to think there must be some conspiracy, some plot. He can't accept that a man would simply do what you did, for no reason." Hatherley opened his eyes. "There was a reason." "Yes?" But Hatherley said nothing more. He would not speak of Eliza, would not speak of Marcus, would not give them any thread to pull that might lead back to his sister. He had done what he had done, and he would bear the consequences alone. That was the bargain he had made, the moment he had seen that signal, the moment he had moved, his life for theirs. It was a fair trade. Graham finished his cigarette and ground it out beneath his heel. He stood picking up the lantern and paused at the door. I'll do what I can," he said. "Not that it will matter, but I'll do what I can." He looked back at Hatherley, and for a moment something like respect flickered in his tired eyes. "You're a brave man, Corporal, or a mad one. I haven't decided which." He left, and the darkness returned, thicker and colder than before. Hatherley leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember. He remembered a small house in a narrow street, the kind of house where every room was needed and none was quite large enough. He remembered his mother, her hands always busy, her voice always gentle, her love a constant presence that had made the poverty bearable. He remembered his father, a laborer who worked himself to death before he was 40, all leaving behind a widow and 3 children and a mountain of debt. He remembered standing at the graveside, 13 years old, holding Eliza's hand while she cried and holding Marcus, barely 5, against his leg and promising himself that he would take care of them, that he would be the man their father could no longer be. He had kept that promise. He had left school, found work, done whatever was necessary to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. When the army had offered a steady wage and a chance to learn a trade, he had taken it, even though it meant leaving them, even though it meant years of separation and the constant fear that something would happen to them while he was gone. He had sent money home, every penny he could spare. He had written letters, long letters full of advice and encouragement and love. And he had watched from afar as Eliza grew into a woman, married, lost her husband, and carried on with a strength that amazed him. He had watched Marcus grow into a young man, too easily led, too quick to trust, too slow to see the dangers that surrounded him. And now, Marcus was in a cell, condemned to die for a crime he did not commit, and Eliza was alone in the world, and James Hatherley sat in another cell, waiting to hang for the crime of saving them both from the final cruelty of that moment. It was not justice, not as the law defined it, but it was something else, something older and deeper, something that no judge and no jury could ever touch. The days passed, each one the same as the last. They brought him food he could not eat, asked him questions he would not answer, offered him comforts he did not want. And the newspapers were full of his story, he was told, full of speculation and outrage and calls for the harshest possible punishment. He was a monster, a traitor, a madman who had attacked the very foundations of British justice. No one could understand why he had done it, because he would not tell them, and so they invented reasons: political fanaticism, personal grievance, a fit of madness brought on by the strain of military service. They could not imagine the truth, because the truth was too simple, too human, too ordinary. He had done it for love. He had done it for family. He had done it because his sister had asked him to, in the only way she could. On the third day, they brought him news. Marcus Thorne's conviction had been stayed, pending an investigation into the circumstances of the courtroom attack. There were questions now, questions that had not been asked before. Why had the guard attacked the judge? What had prompted such violence? And if a man could be driven to such extremes by the proceedings in that courtroom, what did that say about the proceedings themselves? The newspapers, ever hungry for a new angle, had begun to re-examine the trial, to question the evidence, to wonder whether perhaps, just perhaps, there had been a miscarriage of justice in the making. It was too late for James Hatherley, of course. He would still hang. But Marcus Thorne might yet live. When the guard brought him this news, Hatherley listened in silence, his face unchanged. But when the guard had gone, he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. And for the first time since that moment in the courtroom, a small smile touched his lips. Eliza had done it. She had saved him. She had saved them both. And whatever happened now, that was enough. The trial of Corporal James Hatherley was held in the same courtroom where he had committed his crime, before the same judge he had struck down. Sir Alistair Finch presided from the bench, his head still bandaged, his face paler and thinner than it had been, but his eyes as sharp and unforgiving as ever. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been for Marcus Thorne's trial, the public galleries overflowing, the aisles crowded with standing spectators, the press benches filled to capacity with reporters from every newspaper in London. This was a sensation, a story that had captured the public imagination, and no one wanted to miss a moment of it. Hatherley stood in the dock, the same dock where his brother had stood, Abba wearing the same gray prison uniform, his face as impassive as it had been when he stood guard beside the bench. He looked smaller without his uniform, diminished somehow, but there was still something in his bearing that spoke of the soldier he had been, something in the straightness of his back and the steadiness of his gaze that no prison garb could hide. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the jury. He looked only at one face in the crowd, the face of his sister, who sat in the same seat she had occupied throughout Marcus's trial, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on him with an expression of love so pure and so unwavering that it seemed to light the room. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They called witnesses who described the attack in graphic detail, the sudden movement, the raised rifle, the terrible blow that had felled the judge. They called doctors who testified to the severity of the judge's injuries, the months of recovery that lay ahead, the permanent damage that might remain. They called experts who spoke of the sanctity of the courtroom, the necessity of maintaining order and respect, the unforgivable nature of an attack on the very symbol of British justice. It was, they argued, the most serious crime that could be committed, short of murder itself, and it demanded the most serious punishment. Hatherley's defense, such as it was, consisted of Graham, the tired solicitor who had visited him in his cell, making a series of arguments that seemed to carry little weight. He spoke of Hatherley's exemplary military record, his years of faithful service, his medals and commendations. And he spoke of the stress of guard duty, the long hours, the constant pressure. He suggested, delicately, that perhaps the corporal had suffered some kind of breakdown, some temporary madness brought on by the strain of his duties. He called witnesses who testified to Hatherley's good character, his kindness, his devotion to duty. But none of it mattered, and everyone in the room knew it. The crime was too public, too shocking, too direct an assault on the authority of the court. There could be only one outcome. When it was Hatherley's turn to speak, he declined. He stood in the dock and looked at the jury, 12 men and women who would decide his fate. And he said nothing. He could have told them the truth. He could have explained about Eliza, about Marcus, about the signal and the promise and the love that had driven him to act. He could have made them understand. But to do that would be to expose Eliza, to drag her into this, to make her a part of the story in a way that might endanger her, might complicate the legal battles still being fought over Marcus's conviction. He would not do that. He would die silent, and his silence would protect her. And that was enough. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they filed back in, their faces were grim, determined, convinced of the rightness of their decision. The foreman stood and pronounced the words that everyone had expected. Guilty. The judge adjusted his spectacles, and for a long moment he looked at the man in the dock, the man who had struck him down, the man who had dared to raise his hand against the law itself. There was no hatred in his eyes, no anger. There was only a cold satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who sees justice being done. "James Hatherley," he said, his voice calm and measured, "you have been convicted of one of the most serious crimes it is possible to commit. You have attacked not merely a man, but the very institution of justice itself. You have struck at the heart of the rule of law, upon which all civilized society depends. For this, there can be only one punishment." He reached for the black cap, the same cap that had fallen from his head when Hatherley struck him, and he placed it upon his wig. The room was absolutely silent, the silence so complete that it seemed to have weight, to press down upon everyone present. "The sentence of this court is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and from there to a place of execution, and that you there be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul." In the public gallery, Eliza Thorne sat motionless, her hands still folded in her lap, her eyes still fixed on her brother. She did not cry out. She did not faint. She simply looked at him, and he looked back at her, and in that look was everything that could not be said, love and gratitude and sorrow and pride and 1,000 other things that words could never capture. And then the guards were moving, taking him away, and the crowd was surging and shouting, and the trial of Corporal James Hatherley was over. The execution was set for a cold morning in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. The date had been chosen with care, as if the authorities hoped that the holiday season might soften the public's reaction, might distract attention from the grim business being carried out in the prison yard. It did not. The newspapers were full of the story, the public galleries were full of petitioners, and the prison governor received a constant stream of letters, some demanding mercy, others demanding that the sentence be carried out without delay. Through it all, James Hatherley waited in his cell, and through it all, Eliza Thorne waited in her lodgings, and neither of them spoke of what was coming, because there was nothing left to say. Marcus Thorne had been released. The investigation triggered by Hatherley's attack had uncovered inconsistencies in the evidence, witnesses who had been pressured, testimony that had been coerced. The real killer had been found. As a man with a long history of violence who had been seen near the pawnbroker's shop on the night of the murder. Marcus Thorne was free, his name cleared, his life returned to him. He had come to see his brother in prison, had stood outside the cell and wept, had begged forgiveness for the trouble he had caused, the sacrifice that had been made for him. Hatherley had looked at him through the bars, this young man who was his brother, and he had felt nothing but love. "Live," he had said. "Live a good life, that's all I ask. That's all I ever wanted." Marcus had promised, and Hatherley had believed him. It was enough. On the morning of the execution, Eliza came to say goodbye. They allowed her into the cell for 1 hour, and they sat together on the narrow bench, brother and sister, their hands clasped, their heads close together. They did not speak of the gallows or of death, or of the injustice of it all. They spoke of childhood, of their parents, of the small house on the narrow street where they had been happy despite everything. They spoke of memories, of laughter, of the bonds that had held them together through all the years and all the trials. And when the hour was up and the guards came to take him away, Eliza leaned forward and kissed his cheek, and she whispered the words that she had been saving for this moment. "I'll take care of Marcus. I'll make sure he's all right. I'll make sure your sacrifice means something." Hatherley smiled, a real smile, the first in weeks. "I know you will," he said. "You've always taken care of everyone. That's who you are." They led him away, and Eliza walked out of the prison into the cold December morning, and she did not look back. The execution was carried out at dawn in the prison yard before the customary witnesses. Hatherley walked to the gallows with the same straight back and steady gaze that had marked his entire life. He refused a blindfold, refused the offer of a last statement, refused everything except the rope itself. When the trap door opened, he fell without a sound, and within minutes it was over. The newspapers reported it the next day, a brief item on an inside page, overshadowed by more pressing news. A soldier had been hanged for attacking a judge. It was a reminder, the editorialists wrote, that no one was above the law, that justice would always prevail. They did not mention Eliza or Marcus, or the love that had driven a man to sacrifice everything for his family. They did not understand, because they could not understand. They saw only the crime, not the reason. They saw only the punishment, not the cost. Eliza Thorne lived for many years after that day. She raised her brother Marcus, who never forgot the sacrifice that had been made for him, who lived the good life he had promised, who married and had children and told them always the story of their uncle, the soldier who had given everything for love. She grew old, and her hair turned white, and her hands grew gnarled with arthritis. And she never once spoke of that day in the courtroom, never once told anyone the truth of what had happened. But she thought of it always. She thought of the signal she had made, the gesture that had cost her brother his life. She thought of the look in his eyes when he had understood, the nod he had given her as they took him away, and she knew, with a certainty that never wavered, that she had done the right thing. On the 50th anniversary of the execution, an old woman came to the prison where James Hatherley had died. The prison was closed now, abandoned, its walls crumbling and its gates hanging open. She walked through the yard, past the place where the gallows had stood, past the cell blocks where generations of prisoners had suffered and died. She stood for a long time in the cold December air, and then she reached into her pocket and took out a small photograph, faded and worn, of a young man in uniform, his face serious, his eyes kind. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she tucked it back into her pocket and turned away. "He was a good man," she said to the empty air. "He was my brother, and I loved him." The wind carried her words away, And then she walked out through the gates and disappeared into the city. And the story of Corporal James Hatherley passed at last into silence and memory, where all such stories eventually go. But somewhere, in the hearts of those who came after, in the lives that had been saved by his sacrifice, the story lived on. A secret flame burning in the darkness, a testament to the power of love to transcend even the finality of death itself. And perhaps in the end, that was enough. Perhaps that was always enough.